When we last left the slideshow or our lightbox, what we are left with is if I click on a picture, it loads up a picture. The picture doesn't adequately fill the screen. The caption doesn't position itself adequately on page. It's also covering up the control buttons. So every time I click on a caption, if I click on a picture, I can't access my left or right buttons. The caption's in the way. So our plan of attack is we need to resize the pictures so that they fit adequately on the screen. Once we've done that, we will be able to position the controls better on screen so they put themselves where they need to go. And once our controls are positioned better on screen, we will be able to then see the caption and use the controls. And then we will worry about how to deal with scrolling while the lightbox is up and handling the scroll event with jQuery. Okay, so now as we look at our project, we have our large image, we put in the overlay, we are able to show the buttons when we click on the picture. But what we are not able to adequately do is to handle the loading of that picture and then sizing it appropriately to put it on screen, because we need to both size it and know what that size is so that we can position the controls and the caption into their correct places. To accomplish that, what we want to do is to set up a method where we are working with image big, and we are going to use the on event and look for the event of load. Now, when that happens, we are going to call an anonymous function. And as we call that function is going to then call another function. And the reason that I don't just put all of the code here is this particular function, which handles the resizing of the image, we will want to be able to access that in more than one place in the code. Because of that, it makes sense to then wrap it into its own function. And I am going to call that resizebig. Now what I want to also do is just to put in a log statement so that I know that it has been called here. So I will just put log image big has been loaded and will be resized. The usefulness of putting in these log statements is so that as our application or web page is running, we are able to then know when each of our functions is being called as we make our page do different activities. So it helps us to keep track of what is going on. So the next course of action will be to redefine our resizebig function. So I am just going to put it next in my code here. And with that, this will be function resizebig. I'll go down to the closing brace and put and resize big. It's useful to always put a comment on your closing curly braces so that you know what they belong to. If you do that before you start filling up your function with content, it makes it much easier, because this particular function is going to have a lot of nested curly braces, and if we don't have comments helping us keep track of which belongs to which, it's going to be difficult to keep track over the long haul. Inside this resizebig function, we need to know 4 pieces of information to be able to work with this. And these pieces of information that I need to know is I need to know my image height, and fortunately jQuery does have the ability to tell us how big an image is. So I can ask image big and just ask the question height. If we're getting the height of our object, we can assume we're probably also going to need to know the width of our picture. So I height and I width are the image height and the image width values. We're storing these in a variable because we will be referencing them multiple times. Because I'm referencing this particular property of the image multiple times, it makes sense to store it in a variable. One, it simplifies typing. Two, it's better practice if I'm going to, instead of reusing the same jQuery method where I have to query my page and ask how big is that image, is store that in a piece of data so I no longer have to keep asking that question. Next, I will want to know my viewport width and viewport height. In this instance, I'm going to refer to that as a container. So I will choose C height. And now this time I can ask jQuery, what is the size of my window? And that is the viewport. That is the area available inside my browser window. And then get my container width. And that will be equal to window.width. So 4 values that I need to know to be able to figure out what is happening with my project. So I have to access the height and width of my images. Now, I'm also going to need a few other variables as we get this started. So these 4 are pretty self-explanatory. The next 3 should be somewhat self-explanatory. As part of this resizing of the image so that it fills the viewport in a pleasing manner, I want to store that value. Because when I do that, then I can use that value a little bit later. So if I want to store it, I will say my new height. And I don't have a value yet, but I'm making the variable because I will be providing it with a value later. And then it would follow that I will need a new width as well. And I'm also going to need a value. And this is just going to be my ratio. And the ratio is going to be figuring out the size of my image in relation to the size of my container. So I need to know what is the ratio of the image as the height of the container versus the height of the image, or the width of the container versus the width of the image, because I will have to use that to scale my image proportionally. And this is where we have to do a little bit of calculation as part of this process. Now what I want to do is to compare, and I want to find out if my image height is greater than my image width, that tells me, actually I'm just going to log that out, image is portrait. And I will then continue this if statement and say else if image height is less than image width, we'll log out image is landscape. Then finally, else we'll log out something went wrong. So I'm setting up a process to evaluate, is the image a portrait or a landscape image? And if not, then we're assuming that something has gone wrong with the process. As we do this, we can find out if our basic logic in the code is working. Refresh the page, and now if I click on a picture, we'll see it says images landscape. We can see that, of course, it is wider. It also has our message image big has been loaded and will be resized. Okay. Now if I click here, images landscape, click here, images portrait. So we can see that our core functionality in that if statement is off to a good start. And working on portrait first, because that is the easiest one to work on, is we can say our new height is going to be equal to the container height multiplied by 0.9 or 90%. Now we need to figure out our ratio, and our ratio is going to simply be equal to our container height divided by the image height. And then that allows us to set our new width equal to our image width and then we are going to multiply that by the ratio. This is recognizing that we are establishing a proportional relationship between the container and the image, so then that allows us to have a ratio value to work with. Now, this works well for standard size images, but there are use cases where we will get some items that we will have to do further changes to it, but this is a good starting point that will account for a lot of images. But if I change my window size or change the images that I'm loading around, we'll see that we can break this code and have to add in some options to fix it. Now, the width one is going to be very similar, but when the image is a landscape, then we're replacing pretty much everything where we had height. They all now become width elements. And this is one of the nice things. If you hold down a code editor, in a code editor, you're able to change things around a little bit. Oh, and I realized this is wrong up there. But I highlighted height multiple times, and now if I just type in width, it updates all of them. But this is the one that should have been with these two up here. And then here we do want to do the height. And that's going to be my image height, and we'll have to fix the other one. And then up here, this is my image width, not height. So with this, we have the width, ratio is width to width, and then new height is height. Previously height, ratio is height, and then we have width and width multiplied by the ratio. So in doing this, this now sets up values. It doesn't do a change yet. This doesn't actually change the size of the image. All we're doing is figuring out what we want to update it to be. Using jQuery, it's easy to update the CSS properties of an element. So if I take my object and then type in .css, I can do one property, or I can do, in this case, a list of properties, which is what I am going to do. And with this, I'll just put in a comment, update image CSS. It is useful as we work through this to make sure we are keeping these values or these closing statements with comments so that we can track our code as it develops. Now, I just simply type in the CSS property I wish to update and then the value I wish to assign to it. And then I can put a comma and then list the next item. I can do it all in one line, but I find it's easier to read if it is on separate lines, so it's just a comma delineated list of the properties we're updating. So we could update any of the CSS properties of our object on screen. It does seem that as we go through this, we adjust the width, and while the height has been adjusted to 90% of the container height, after we figure out the proportional ratio of image to container, we multiply the image by that. We still need to adjust it by 90% as well. So when I was looking at the previous finished code, I realized that it needed that extra percentage reduction to size correctly. It's a subtle change, only a 10% change, but it is necessary for getting the code to fit properly. So now the images are resizing themselves on screen, but we don't have access to our buttons or controls yet because they don't know how big they need to be to show up on screen. Now I can verify that because if I log out, and what I will do is I'm just going to log out a message of controls with here, if I can spell it correctly. And now with that, I will then just send myself a message, and we're going to find out how big. Now these log statements you don't have to put in, but again, they are useful as we are trying to track what is happening within our project. So I'm asking for what is the size of my controls. We can see the controls are 64 pixels wide, so that's not really giving me the size that I want because I ideally want the controls to be the size of my image. What this tells me is I would probably be well served by accessing the controls and setting their CSS property of width, and we'll set it equal to the new width, which is the size of our image. Now in this instance, you will notice that I put everything on one line. There's no extra curly braces like the resize on image big because I'm only changing a single property instead of multiple properties of that element. So refreshing the page, we can see the controls. My arrows did land to the far right side of the screen. Whoa! Something funky's going on here. Let's try and see better what's going on. Okay, so there we see a picture. Let's go to this next one. Okay.
The other one looks fine, but the other two look wacky.
The code and try and figure out what is going on. So, order of operation. When I first click on a picture, image big inside of its on method, so this on load, meaning once the picture has been loaded, it calls resize big. When it calls resize big, it sets the image height equal to image big's height. And then it sets the width equal to the width, container height. Now if I look at my arrow keys, I can see that I changed the source of an image, and then we're going to update the image and title. And we can see that, wait, all we're doing is changing the source of the image. So if we're changing the source of the image, at that point it doesn't fire off and resize our picture. So that's now a problem. So if we can change that source, but it's not resizing it. So we could fire off a resize and work with that and try to access it. We're going to find that there's some other little gotchas along the way. About the misshapen proportionals of my image, I do look at my caption. I'll see that the caption isn't quite where I want it to be. So I want to adjust the caption. I want to drop it down to the bottom of the screen so that it shows up into a better position. So to pull this off, we want to adjust both the size of the caption and its position, and we can do that easily through jQuery. So inside of jQuery, we can see we update the image, and now we set the width of the controls, so now that's giving us access to the controls. But every time we load the image, we need to reposition the caption, and we need to send the caption to a new place. So to do that, it's the same kind of thing. So we're going to send the caption with its CSS, and with this we're going to send it to a new option. We may have to do some other changes to it, so I'll use this syntax. And I want to position its top somewhere. And now this is the question. Where do we need it to go? So by setting the width of our element, the height of the element to new height, which is the height of the image, divide that by 2, and then we have to pull it up by 32. 32 happens to correspond to a magical thing, which is the height of the images that are being loaded for my left and right buttons, because they are 32 pixels in size. And when I look at my caption, we can see that now it's there. But what I want to also do is I want my caption to update its width to my new width. And when I do that, remember when we have a list of CSS properties, we always put commas between them, and then we put the list of properties inside curly braces. And then we end with a semicolon. So now when I load it, we'll see that the text shows up at the bottom, and it is now filling the width of the screen. And it will work on each of the images. We still have the interesting problem of the images not resizing themselves properly. And we also have another weird problem that certain images, if they're too big, are now scaling out. So we will have to address that as we move into round 2 of our image resize adjustments. Because the on method is called with image big load, what's going to happen is when that image loads new content, it will cause resizebig to be called, even though we only referenced it here clicking on the picture. If I look at my buttons don't call resizebig, except for the fact that they are changing the source of the image. And when they change that source, that means I have to load a new image file. And when I have to load a new image file, my browser doesn't forget that we said, well, image big, when you load pictures, call resizebig. So it remembers that even though we're not explicitly calling resizebig a second time. That is a method that then becomes attached to our image, so that when it tries to load something, it automatically is now going to call resizebig again. And if we clear the width and height of the image before it loads, then when it loads a new image, it will reset those values to the new image's content. So that looks like this. ImageBig.css, and we're nuking its CSS value, not its actual empirical pixel data that's part of the image file. So saying I want no width in it, we just put as empty quotes. Now I can repeat that for the height as well. And when I do this, I am telling it. Now I could have used a curly brace list and set both of these in one statement, but for this particular purpose, I like the cleanness of seeing it delineated each line like this. It just makes me happy to see it that way. But this says I want the height and width to be effectively empty, so then it's going to reestablish it. I click on a picture. We'll see that now the picture is sizing correctly and we're not getting the weird squished kitty syndrome, because that was fairly traumatic to see the kitty squished into the odd proportion. Looking at the lightbox, there's certain situations where it breaks. So if I have a landscape orientation to my screen and I click and load a landscape image that just so happens to then be able to scale up widthwise, but its overall height is still too big, then that's causing a problem. So we need to address that even though we wanted to size this image based on its width, it turns out we need to size it based on its height. So we're going to have to flip-flop things a little bit. But what this means is if the width of the image, or in this case, if the height of the image is greater than the height of the container after we have scaled it, then we're going to have to adjust our sizing. And we can see the same thing happen if our container is too small for our picture. It's harder to trigger it on the small size, but okay, so there it's really not fitting. I need a taller image to pull it off on the portrait size, but the logic will be the same. So when I go to load it, we'll be able to take care of that. Looking in the code, we can see that if the image height is greater than the image width, we're assuming then the image is portrait. If the image height is less than the image width, then we know it's landscape. Since we were able to see that one happen with the Bill Murray, then we are going to work with that one first. So what we can do is, after we've recalculated a new height and a new width, then we're going to ask the question if our new height is greater than my container height, meaning it's going to then be too big. So we've scaled it to a landscape image, but if the height is still going to be too big, then we are going to need to do a little bit of surgery here. And we are going to have to essentially just use these lines up here, resizing the height to the container height, and then create a ratio to set the width appropriately. So what we're able to do with this, can copy, paste it in, and now we'll give this one a go and see how it works. Now I'm going to just log out another statement here and say landscape height was too big and required resize. Doing this so that we can see when things are happening inside the code. And now if I look at what showed up on screen, image is landscape. Landscape height was too big and required resize, so we can see that it resized itself. Perfect. Okay, now that one doesn't need it, so it just said image is landscape. Go here. Our image is portrait. So now that is working. We can perform the same operation to our portrait. So if, after we've resized everything, our new width is greater than our container width, it's going to be the same kind of option. Copy, paste, and once again I want to put in a log statement, portrait width was too big and required resize. This allows us to then handle the use cases where if our screen is too big or too small, or we have an image that is too wide or too anything, and we're able to then modify appropriately. One of the issues that comes up is, well, my image, if I'm looking at an image, I can scroll and the whole overlay scrolls away. And we can fix that in one of two ways. We can use jQuery to fix it, or we can use CSS. So if I use my CSS and change the position of the overlay to fixed, refresh my page, I can click, and the overlay stays in place no matter how much I scroll. So I can resize the window, the overlay grows to fit, but our image isn't resized, and so we will want to address that too. But the nice part is that it stays fixed. If we decide to not do it through CSS, even though I think that would be the better solution, but we'll look at another one because there are certain effects to be achieved by using the jQuery scroll function. And that's what I want to take a look at here. So when we use the jQuery scroll function, it'll be easy enough just to have it up here near the top. Put a comment in, trap the scroll event. We can have jQuery monitor the window, and we will call the scroll function, which will then call an anonymous function. And when we call this anonymous function, what we are going to do is we will just set the CSS of the overlay. And we'll set its CSS. In this case, the only property that we have to set on it is going to be its top position. And we will set it to a value of the top of the body. So we grab the body tag, and we will set it equal to scroll top. So when we are referencing things using inside the curly braces, we do property, colon, and value. We don't put a semicolon at the end, though you may have noticed out of habit I automatically type the semicolon. If I put it in there, I will get an error message in my console. Now, if we're wondering what scroll top does, we refer to the jQuery API to get some more information about that particular element. So we can see scroll allows us to, it's a method that jQuery can now be monitoring the scroll and then call a function to make something happen. So if I scroll on a page, you can see when I scroll, it says, hey, look, something happened. So we can see where it displays this, and then it tells it to fade out. So we change the CSS property, and then we specify an animation, which is how it gets that scrolling event to occur. Now, if I look for scroll top, I'll see scroll top, and it gets the vertical position of the scroll bar for the first element. Well, the vertical position I want is, in this case, the scrolling of the body. So I want to know where is the body when it is scrolling. And if I turn off this view so we can see we have the scroll bar over here, we're asking what is the position of that scroll bar, in this case, for the body. So we're asking for the scroll top. So now when I refresh my page, we can see that it stays in place. I'm noticing that the CSS option gives me a much smoother playback. And this is one of the issues of using the scroll top position, because I am having to what is referred to as repaint or redraw the elements on screen because I'm changing their position. I tried to scroll and I'm hijacking that and changing their position. And that is part of why we don't get that smooth experience. But when I finish scrolling, it has returned itself back to that top position. So while this works, it's useful for other features that it would be more effective when we're trying to control everything on screen, a large image and the overlay. When things in the background are scrolling, it gets a little bit jerky. So this is something that we may come back to on future projects for some other visual effects. But for right now, I think commenting it out and instituting an overlay a position of fixed is going to give a much smoother scrolling experience. So now when I scroll, the background is smooth and clean on top. We'll be looking at using resize because what we find is there's a resize event. So every time you change the size of the viewport, it triggers a resize event. So if we look at this, we can read the specifics on it. But we have window, resize, and then what we want to have happen inside an anonymous function. So I'm going to use something along the lines of what we see right here as part of our resizing option. Now we can stick this anywhere we want. As long as I'm here in the code, I'll just put it at this point. So once again, it's window, dot resize function curly, go down. We can end that and resize. So first I just want to log out window has been resized. Refresh this. Now if I change the size, we can see that as I was scaling this, my image isn't changing size, but it's kicking out the message, window's been resized, window's been resized. And if I were using a mobile, every time I change orientation, that's triggering off a resize event as well. And if you've ever been on your mobile device and you've been looking at a page that is using some version of a lightbox, we've probably all been stuck in a situation where now we lose access to the controls because the developer chose not to deploy a resize awareness happening because of the orientation change, and now you're locked out of being able to manipulate anything on screen. So from a usability standpoint, that's really bad form. That's one of the bigger reasons that we would choose to do this. We're less concerned about, oh, that picture didn't scale properly. It's more that now the user's lost access to any controls that they should have. Now if they click, it goes away, but we need to make sure that we are being aware of and respectful of that user situation. The good part about doing this resizing option is we have the function already written, and we can just call resizebig. Now, if I am looking at my picture and rotate, we can see it scales. If I go to the kitty picture, rotate, it resizes and scales. So we're able to change that. As I change the size, the image repaints itself to the new scale.